Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This is a women-only webinar, and if you're a man, watch it later on YouTube. It will be on YouTube tonight. Today we are hearing about the Dale Spender on women's ideas and writing, and it's being discussed by Kate Newey. So thank you so much, Kate, and over to you.
Thanks, Joe. And it's lovely to be here. I haven't been able to be in the this setting for a while, so it's really lovely to be here. And it was right. Yes, I'm trying to work out. Yeah, I think I've shared my screen now. Yes, here we are. It was a really lovely opportunity to revisit Dale Spender's work. I think I spoke about her work on Mothers of the Novel last year. And this has been so serendipitous because in her book that I'm going to talk about, Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them, um, she says a lot about theories of history for women and for feminists. And it's extraordinary, the book that you need to read and you don't know. And I'm writing something else for something else entirely, and I needed to read this book. So it's wonderful to be able to talk about it this morning to everyone here. And thank you for indulging me, indeed. Dale Spender died a couple of years ago. So I just thought, again, it's worth remembering her. I was lucky enough to meet her once at a seminar when I was a PhD student at the University of Sydney. And true to form, she was dressed in purple, white, and green. And it's interesting for someone who writes in such a, as you'll see in some of the quotations I'm going to work through this morning, someone who writes in such an uncompromising way. Her personal manner was always really calm and rational and um, really engaging and about collaboration. And she writes a lot about that as well. So she wrote a lot in her life. I mean, her productivity is just extraordinary. And this is a kind of selected list. She starts with man-made language, which was based on her PhD, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit today. And then part of her work, I think, has really been about the recovery of women who were always there, but made invisible. And Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them, the book I'm talking about this morning, is really about that process of how women were visible and then became invisible. And Dr. Spender's attempts to make them visible again. So there's more books and more books. I think probably only Sheila can boast of Sheila Jeffries can have a longer list of materials. And of course, there were many women. There may even be some in the seminar today, and I know of several women who worked with Dale Spender as her research assistants. So it was always a collaborative effort. And so I spoke last year about Mothers of the Novel, 100 Good Women Writers Before Jane Austen. And it's about the active feminist recovery. Um, and I also wanted to remember this book, Living by the Pen, Early British Women Writers, which is published 10 years after Women of Ideas, but I think reflects on these really exciting decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in recovering. I mean, I've used the word discovery there, but it's probably recovery of women's intellectual works. And I just wanted to note that this book, Living by the Pen, came from the University of London Women's Studies Summer Institute, which ran a course called Early British Women Writers. And there is still a group, those of you who are based in London can get to it. There is still a group that meets monthly, generally on a Saturday afternoon, I think, that meets to discuss early British women writers. So that might be something at the University of London, but it's pretty open. I've attended on occasions. So the other book that I just wanted to mention before I go into Women of Ideas is this book, Man-Made Language, and it was based on her PhD. And she writes in the preface to the second edition, so it's republished, she writes that her fundamental premise was pretty simple. Um, and she was quite surprised that no one had really thought about this before. I mean, I think people had, but I mean, she puts it all together. I was arguing that men controlled the language and it worked in their favor. And that's a really important basis for thinking, for her thinking in Women of Ideas. So it's over 500 pages, and I'll show you my library copy, which is pretty thick. And it's a huge intellectual and historical sweep. And I'm not going to be able to talk about everything. I'm going to focus on a couple of women that she talks about, but also on her whole sort of intellectual approach. Because what she's arguing for is developing a woman-centered theory of knowledge and a woman-centered theory of history. And in my field of being an academic nerd, I would then talk about a woman-centered or feminist, indeed, epistemology, that's the theory of knowledge, and a theory of history, I would talk about feminist historiography. So you can see why it's such a treat to revisit this book and to talk about it to you this morning. So I'm going to do a lot of quoting from Dale Spender, and I'm trying to keep to time. Let's see how we go. So this is the first paragraph of the book. And I think one of the things it does is, I mean, and to be really frank, Dale Spender was not a woman without controversy in many ways. And she talks about her very last paragraph, which we'll come to. She talks about the kind of internecine arguments between feminists and between women. But I think what's really lovely about this opening paragraph and about her reflections throughout the book is that she's not afraid to talk about what she didn't know. And she starts by saying, "Why didn't I know?" This book has its origins in my personal experience. In the late 1960s, an overriding issue in my life was to find out whether other women felt and thought as I did in a male-dominated society. It soon became apparent I was not alone. And so she talks about how women came to talk to each other. And I mean, I can remember as a 17-year-old undergraduate in the late 70s, joining my feminist group at my university and joining a consciousness raising group. And I think this is a process that many women went through, particularly in the second wave, and still do go through. We talk to each other. And we find out that we're not bonkers. It's not us, it's the system, it's patriarchy. And I think that that is a process that many feminists go through, but that also one has to wonder how much of a waste of energy and spirit might that be if we knew some of our history. And I think that's really what Dale Spender is suggesting, that elation that goes with finding, as she says, a more meaningful and positive way of viewing the world and ourselves. And she then goes on to say, some of us were vaguely aware that we did have a past. And I think of Virginia Woolf, who says, we think back through our mothers if we are writers. This idea that we women as a category, as a sex class, as we are now allowed to say, we always were allowed to say, have a past. Spender goes on to say, vague suppositions gave way to more systematic and persistent questions. Where there were women who had felt like this in the past, how many of them were there and what have they said? So that is really the rest of her book. But she actually theorizes this and says that by asking those big questions about women as a class or a category in history, we start to remove it from the individual. And she says here, while we had been ready to believe the lessons of our own education and to accept there was but a handful of women in the past who had protested against male power, that they were eccentric at best and more usually close to neurotic, embittered, and quite unrepresentative, But then she says, when we see that there were many more women and they had been representative of their sex and that they had disappeared, she concludes the problem assumed very different proportions. She also then, and I'm jumping ahead here in her introduction, she goes on to talk about raising these questions as a student at university and being told by her tutor, well, yes, but it's not really the main question of history. And she writes, yet, and I think these words are particularly pertinent in Britain in this very moment, yet without any direct experience of what it feels like to be half of humanity, men have proceeded to describe and explain the world from their point of view and have assumed that their partial experience of the world, and that is Spender's own emphasis on partial, their partial experience of the world is all that exists. Women's experiences, non-existent, invisible, unreal from the outset. And it is my contention that if patriarchy is to be preserved, women's invisibility must remain. And you read that sentence, you go, what? And then she goes on, obviously, this is not, for me, a state to be desired. You're thinking, whew, she's saying what I think she's saying. So I'm going to jump ahead a bit, and I'm sorry, I've only got a paper copy, and my typing is terrible. So I haven't kind of copied out her whole table of contents. But she starts with a part one, which is titled Mary Wollstonecraft and Her Foremothers. And she goes through a number of Marys, Mary Wollstonecraft, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, Mary Astle, and a couple of other writers. And this is really looking at really the 17th and 18th centuries. She then goes on to part two, which is 1800 to 1850, and calls that the silent years with a question mark, the interrogative, and actually shows us that these were not the silent years for women. And it's from there that I'm going to take two of her examples. Then part three looks at North America and Great Britain and the kind of forerunners at the end of the 19th century of the suffragist question and the suffragist movement. She then, in part four of the book, goes through the 20th century, looks at the role of women in revolution. So looks at Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Then goes on to the British militancy for the suffrage in the first part of the 20th century in Britain. And then the aftermath, and looks at some really interesting women. I wish, all of them we could look at in detail every Sunday for the next few years. People like Cicely Hamilton, Elizabeth Robbins, Winifred Holtby, Vera Brittain, who of course was the mother of Shirley Williams, Rebecca West, Olive Schreiner, Ray Strachey, Dora Russell, Virginia Woolf. And then she comes to the 1950s, looking at Mary Ritter Beard, Viola Klein, Mira Komorowski, Simone de Beauvoir, Margaret Mead, and then comes to a conclusion, which she calls reinventing rebellion. So what I'm going to do for the next, till whenever Joe stops me really, is to look at two examples that Dale Spender picks up from the early 19th century. That's my scholarly field, so I felt most comfortable there. One of them I knew nothing about, and the other woman I had encountered. And then I'm going to jump forward to really pull some quite substantial quotations from Dale Spender's conclusion, which they're just extraordinary to read them. I'm sorry, this whole talk is kind of in the aftermath of the British Supreme Court decision that, yes, women are a biological sex legally. And I think it's interesting to reflect 40 years on, where are we after this kind of work. It's also exhilarating to read a book like this, to read about the Women's Studies Institute, to read books where feminist writers don't have to hedge about what they mean. You know, Dale Spender could just go, these are women and they're important, and this is why they're important. But I will start with her comment on Mary Wollstonecraft. Um, uh, and again, what she's trying to argue in this book is that there are no specific originary points. There's no one woman who starts it, but she does identify Mary Wollstonecraft as a turning point, not the beginning of a particular feminist tradition, because she's trying to argue that this feminist tradition has been with us for as long as we've had a history. But she does identify Mary Wollstonecraft in the tradition of the disagreeable woman. That is, a woman who will not try and gain a hearing by being agreeable to men. And I think that's a really interesting sort of articulation and identification to make. So, the other thing that I think is really interesting about what Spender writes is a theory of history. And so this paragraph, and it's something I'm working on in other work in my life. So when I came to this paragraph, I thought, yes, I was meant to read this book for this seminar. Before making such an assessment of women's history, we should look closely at our own assumptions, at the framework we're using to make sense of the world, at the origins and purposes of our value system. Many contemporary feminists are extremely suspicious of the assumption that change is accomplished by revolutionary activity. Not only do they suspect this may be an explanation which arises from male experience of the world and which has been used to justify and explain male behavior, past and present, they also think it destructive and a not very effective way of procuring change. Sorry, I've misquoted there. And in fact, she goes on to quote a feminist theorist, Elizabeth Serra, who talks about ejaculatory theories of history. You know, mapping completely the way men think onto a particular model of male sexuality. Which I find very, well, I'm trivial. I found it quite amusing, but I think it makes a really important point about our tendency to think of history as moments of extreme change, of revolution, whereas Spender is arguing for this much more collaborative, consensual, organic way of thinking about change and progress. So my first case study that I pulled out of Dale Spender's massive number of case studies is a woman called Frances Wright. And basically, because I didn't know anything about her. And she was a really early abolitionist. She was born in Scotland in a well-to-do family, but she was orphaned quite early in life. And her guardian was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. But as soon as she was of age and free of this guardianship, she travelled to America, and the rest of her life was lived between the United Kingdom and America. And after her trip to America, she wrote a book, Views of Society and Manners in America. It precedes a much more famous English woman writing about America, and that is Frances Trollope, Anthony Trollope's mother, who wrote a book on manners in America. But Frances Wright made some money out of that, and she used that money to speak widely against enslavement in America and to buy land and enslaved people to set up a cooperative community near Memphis, Tennessee. And she purchased enslaved people and obviously freed them because she argued that it was a duty of, you know, white slave masters, as we might call them today, slave owners, to prepare previous enslaved people for the economic independence that they were going to have once, you know, what she thoroughly believed in, which was their freedom and the abolition of enslavement of people. It failed. And she spent the rest of her life as a public lecturer. But this is what Spender says about the failure of Nashoba. The Americans in this webinar might correct the way I'm saying that word, but yeah, that was the name of the community. Spender writes, how readily are the deficiencies, in inverted commas, of women constructed without reference to the reliability of the records or acknowledgement of the enormous bias against women? In the case of Nashoba, I have not seen it mentioned that most cooperative ventures, past or present, and on a large or small scale, have been abandoned. Right is condemned for the collapse rather than commended for the commitment. And I think that's a really important point. Robert Owen's millenarian community in Scotland, Saltaire, various other experiments in community living were made in Britain and America. They all failed in one way or another, although they all left huge legacies that we live with today still, and we still think about. But Wright is condemned for her failure. You know, this is the glass ceiling and the glass cliff all rolled up into one. So her main influence was touring America as a lecturer and the publication of her lectures in a course of public lectures in 1829. And Spender argues that Frances Wright was one of the founding mothers of women's studies, and she uses that term, women's studies, because, and I'm quoting here from what you can see on the slide, Wright recognizes that women are invisible in encoded knowledge. We simply cannot be added on. And this is the really important point, that women must participate in the construction of knowledge and not be the mere recipients of knowledge encoded by men and which serves men's interest. And her term was free inquiry, but the phenomenon she was describing is the one often being addressed in women's studies today. And in my working life as an academic, this idea that women can construct knowledge is really central to what I teach and what I research. So when I read this, I thought, bingo, you know, this is beautiful. And what Spender also goes on to tell us about Wright is that she was interested in knowledge not as a competitive procedure or sort of competitive commodity, but to explain and improve the world. So knowledge not for status, but to free the oppressed. And you can see that in her practical work. You know, she purchased people, which is quite an extraordinary thing to even think about or say out loud. But she wanted to give them knowledge, to get them involved in their own freedom and their own kind of working through the aftermath of freedom from enslavement. So there's a practice and a theory here, I think, that Spender is alerting us to. So in words which have not lost their resounding ring, Wright urges the oppressed to break our mental leading strings and to examine closely where our ideas come from and why it is we know what we know. Oh, sorry, I was dictating this and you can see it hasn't converted my full stop into the, sorry, into the punctuation. She advocates that we be suspicious of what we have learned about ourselves and our society, and her words of wisdom would be appropriate introduction in any women's studies classroom today. Would that we still had women's studies classrooms. Also, Spender identifies, Wright acknowledged or recognized that knowledge was power. And she asserts there can be no just knowledge until both sexes can engage equally in the work of inquiry. This is all completely rational. You know, you read it and you just go, gosh, these things are so simple and so basic and foundational, but they still need to be said again and again and again. And this is part of Spender's theme in the book. So my next, I'm sorry, I'm galloping through this. My next case study, or Spender's case study that I've pulled out because I thought it would be interesting. I was up in the Lake District over Easter, and I do my usual walk through Ambleside and identify Harriet Martineau's house there, which is not noted in any way, really. It's a private residence, and I think that I gather the owners sometimes get a bit tired of people knocking on their door and going, is this where Harriet Martineau lived? But it's part of Spender's argument that not many people know who Harriet Martineau is. And I think this is still less the case, but it is still the case. She's not really seen as one of the really eminent Victorian 19th century thinkers, although she should be. And really, she's a very interesting case study in so many ways. She was due to be married to someone that apparently she loved very much, but he died, and she never married again. Now, one might, there are various theories about this. Spender doesn't speculate about Martineau's sexuality, interestingly, but she does speculate that Martineau perhaps realized that by being engaged to a man, but then him dying, she could take on a particular persona of the grieving fiance, which meant that she could stave off pressure for her to actually end up marrying someone else, which gave her a freedom, but also gave her a position as a quite respectable woman in her current society and culture in the first half of the 19th century, when really, you know, this idea of the Victorian woman was the respectable middle class woman was very powerful. And in fact, Spender acknowledges that Martineau, unlike Mary Wollstonecraft and indeed Frances Wright, whom she calls disagreeable women, that Martineau actually worked to be an agreeable woman. And you know, I think it's something to think about. As feminists today, we sometimes are quite suspicious of women like that. And I think that we need to kind of cut them some slack sometimes. And sort of go, well, you know, maybe for Martineau, this was a pragmatic choice, that she could do more and they would leave her alone and she could get on with writing. And indeed, she got on with writing. And throughout the 1830s, she wrote these pamphlets called the Illustrations of Political Economy. And we would now see her as quite a right-wing neoliberal economist, but she's trying to argue for a particular way of seeing the world. And in fact, Spender goes on to defend her against those charges of Martineau being a kind of neoliberal. But what Spender starts to do is to sort of say, you know, you can see the figures there that on the slide that I'm talking around at the moment. By 1834, she sold 10,000 copies of illustrations. And Spender contrasts this with John Stuart Mill's sales for his book a few years later on political economy, which was around 3,000. I think there's something there about the different ways that they publish. Martineau wants to speak to a working class audience. And so she publishes in very cheap pamphlets in parts that you could collect every month. Whereas Mill is speaking to his equals, the men, you know, who run the country. And so he's writing a solid book, and books in the middle of the 19th century were very expensive. You know, they would cost in the region of several pounds. And when you think that a working class man might earn £1.50 a week and a woman would earn less than £1 a week, you can see how what Martineau is doing is picking a publication mode to suit the audience she wants to speak to. But these things all mitigate against her. And this is Spender's kind of judgment of the historical treatment of Martineau. This intellectual and creative contribution of Martineau's deserves careful consideration. Had she been a male and made a contribution of this nature, she would probably have been accorded an important place amongst the founders of social science. Her life and her work would no doubt have been well known, and as a distinguished intellectual, she would have attracted considerable scholarly attention, which in itself helps to perpetuate a reputation. And today, there would be debates about her ideas and their contemporary relevance. But because a woman, she has almost disappeared. And when I read this, I thought, oh, I want to do a bit of digging, because Spender argues that the records and the archives of Martineau have all been sort of dispersed. In fact, the LSE, the Women's Library at the London School of Economics, has, I looked this up this morning, has a substantial archive of Martineau's papers. It's 6 boxes, which, if you've worked in an archive and you're working through a box, it's quite a lot. I mean, it's probably not the shelf length collection of, for example, John Stuart Mill's works, or I think someone who's a better male comparator to Martineau would be John Ruskin, who wrote in part he wanted to reach a working class audience. He also, ended his life in the Lake District. But, both Mill and Ruskin might be comparators for Martineau in terms of treatment and reputation. And I think although the situation is a little better for studies of Harriet Martineau now, both more popular and more scholarly, it's a little better than when Spender was writing in the early 1980s. It's still not the kind of level of reputation of, say, John Stuart Mill and John Ruskin, both of whom who have, major international research centres that look at their work at various universities. So, there's no centre for Martineau studies, as far as I know. Be a really good one if there were. So, right, I've been going for half an hour, so I'm going to try. The conclusion might take me almost as long, I'm sorry, but hopefully we'll stop with a little bit of time to look at some questions and comments in the chat. But I wanted to jump right forward. As you can see, I'm jumping from the page 200, or no, page 100 and something in the book to page 527. And I'm really pulling out a series of paragraphs with which Spender ends her book, because I think what they do is shift her thinking and her arguments about history and knowledge into the present. The book is published in 1982. So presumably she's writing this in about 1980 in Britain in 1980. I actually wasn't living in Britain in 1980, but I saw enough of what was going on then. This is the neoliberal moment. This is the moment I think of Maggie Thatcher as leader of the Conservative Party, if not Prime Minister. This is a moment of, I think, in Britain, certainly, and indeed where I was living in Australia, a moment of kind of self-reflection on where we had got to as a women's liberation movement. And if you remember some of the debates then, I think I see them nowadays as well, the discussion of radical feminism, socialist feminism, what we called often choice feminism or liberal feminism. We say, well, that's got us today. But anyway, so I think that's the context for these. It's also, and I'm reminded of that in a couple of the things that Spender writes in her conclusion. It's also really, I think, the peak of the Cold War before 1989 in Perestroika. And I can remember there being in Germany, in a town where a member of my family lived, weekly air raid siren testings and so on. So she's writing at a sense of crisis, and I think this underlines what she says in the conclusion and the kind of manifesto that she develops. So she's interested in this idea of progress, that perhaps there's been no progress for women when it comes to the recognition that women exist creatively and intellectually in their own right, is a concept difficult to formulate in patriarchal culture, partly because the belief in progress is so deeply entrenched. It is a belief bolstered by the premises of growth and expansion which underlie capitalism, by the justification of evolutionary theory and the construction of history as a steady march of human improvement. It is almost beyond our comprehension to question the notion of progress. And I think we are now questioning the notion of progress. I know in my own university teaching, I ask students to consider that progress might be the last, what we call grand narrative of the 19th century, and to think about the difference between thinking about historical change and thinking about history as progress. There's a whole historiographic theory about the Whig view of history, the idea that history is always written by the winners, and that history is always progress, that change is always progress. And I think the last few years have made me, certainly, I don't know about other people, but they've made me really rethink that in a very personal, fundamental way. These are the first opening paragraphs of her conclusion, by the way. The absurdity of this concept, that is, of progress, is not challenged by the insanity of nuclear weapons, the willful end, increasing destruction and pollution of this planet, or by the grossly inequitable distribution of resources. Society needs the concept of progress to legitimate as the high point of civilization many of its current barbaric practices. Yet this concept of progress and all that goes with it has its origins in men's consciousness. It is formed from the perspective of dominance and demands the denial of life-sustaining values, including the denial of women and thinking explaining their existence. I do not think it is a superficial or indulgent activity to argue for women's intellectual resources in the current crisis context. And just in sort of footnote there, I think it's really interesting that she sees 1980 to 1982 as a current crisis. I think it is an absolute necessity. We must assert the validity of our own consciousness and that of our foremothers. And then I think this is her theme throughout the book. We are not the first women to have known what we know. We are not without precedents, despite the frequency with which we and our foremothers are presented as new. We are not inventing our rebellion, but reinventing it. And I love that phrase. I just think that's beautiful and brilliant. You know, it really gives us a sense of what's come before and how we can use it. While I cannot, and now I'm on to her last few paragraphs. So these are literally the last two pages of the book, pages 530 and 31. There is actually a really interesting appendix, which is from Sylvia Pankhurst's Life in Prison, which don't read if you're faint-hearted and squeamish. It's horrible. But, you know, it gives you a sense of the violence meted out by the state on suffragettes. Anyway, while I cannot, so this is the book. Yeah, so I'm now going to really just give a précis or a quick run through of her last paragraphs. While I cannot in good conscience advocate a war against men with the purpose of conquest, I mean, the irony is, in her acknowledgements, she's actually married to a man and she thanks him for the help and support. You know, I mean, it's a wonderful reversal. And I think it shows how she's thinking of women as a category rather than about personal lives, in a sense. While I cannot in good conscience advocate a war against women with the purpose of conquest, I can nonetheless see that there is a conflict of interest between women and men while the world is arranged in its present form, and that it is self-destructive for women to deny this conflict and the power base that underlies it. I do not seek victory over men. I do not wish to deny in full their values and their creations, but I want to deny again and again that their values in creation are the only ones that society can utilize. I want coexistence. Would that we had it, I say. I want women actively to resist, to refrain from cooperating with men, to cease making our resource available to men, who are likely to then use against us what they have taken. I want men to be irrelevant to our enterprise of constructing our own knowledge. I do not want them revered. I'm advocating non-violent, non-cooperation. And I think this is a really interesting variation, if you like, on some of the movements of particularly second wave feminism, of separatism. And I think she's trying to make her peace with how you live in a world with men, but how you resist without without kind of having to completely separate you know, it's a quite, I think there's a pragmatism here that I appreciate. You know, I'm advocating non-violent, non-cooperation. And she goes on, I've cut a little bit, but she does go on to talk about this non-violent non-cooperation in terms of what Mahatma Gandhi saw when he came to Britain at the height of the suffragette movement and the non-violent, well, it got violent, but their sense of resistance through non-cooperation. And he used, and she says he learned from that. He learned from the suffrage movement. Extinction Rebellion, I think, has said they've learned from the suffrage movement. And it's this non-violent non-cooperation. This is the second last paragraph. Very interesting in the current context. As males cannot be authorities on women's experiences, what they make of this thesis does not much matter. But as they possess enormous power, what does matter is what they can take and use. I have tried to practice what I preach and to provide them with as little as possible. So, and I'm the way I interpret that, just to gloss that statement, is that although she does mention men throughout the book, she very rarely uses male scholarship to talk about the women. She quotes a lot of other women, and I think and she talks about these women as women. She doesn't talk about their families or their husbands very much. She gives a very brief sketch of their lives and their relationships with their necessary often relationships with men, but that's not her focus. And if you look at her bibliography, it's pretty much all female scholarship. So I think that's how she's, her practice in the book. I cannot condone violence against the enemy, but I can withdraw my labor from the exploiter and will not be swayed by the argument that he has more rights, that his interest is greater, his authority more legitimate. And this is the final paragraph of the book. And I don't know, because I wasn't, I was still only 20 in 1980, and I wasn't living in Britain, and I was, still wide-eyed and wet behind the ears about feminism. But people in this webinar might know what she's referring to here, but her last paragraph is actually very much about female solidarity. I do not believe that women are now of age so that it is perfectly in order for us to start criticizing each other in public forums. And she doesn't give any explicit examples. She just says attacking, condemning, demolishing, deriding. I think she's also saying we don't have to be like men and attack each other to be competitive about knowledge. Anyway, for I know, as women have found again and again, that our words will be taken down and used as evidence against us. We play into men's hands when we represent our sex negatively. We oblige them by doing some of their work for them. I know we are perfectly capable of generating our own valid meanings, and I know that we do not all agree. I even know that I will never agree with some women, but my criticisms are in private until the view of a woman carries the same weight as a man's and is not just the raw data for his patriarchal products. While the world is arranged as it is, I choose to assert my intellectual and creative existence as a woman and to promote a positive representation of women's lives, values, and ideas. And then her final sentence, let men do what they will with this. So that's a complete gallop through Dale Spender's extraordinary volume. And I've spoken quickly. I'm sorry if it's too quick. But hopefully there's time then to pick up. Yeah, that's my final slide. There's time to pick up, if I can find it, on the chat. Jo, should I stop sharing my screen? Would that be the way to go
Yes,
forward?
yeah, I think so. And let's see if Marion or Sheila want to join, and then
Yeah, I would be.
they might be able to say something that will mean you have time to read the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I have
I'm
somehow
happy
added
to
myself.
join, Jo. That's fine.
Brilliant,
Yeah, I would be
fantastic.
really
So
interested in
I'm
hearing
going to
their
add
responses.
Marion and Sheila, if you put your screen on, your video on, ask to
I
start.
can't start my video, it says, because you have to start it.
I can't start it either. I've done this thing, ask to start video, so you might have a button that pops up. There we are. It's on.
And I'll just whiz through the
Add
chat.
spotlight. There we are. Okay. So maybe if Sheila or Marion add something, then it gives Kate some time.
Yeah, yes. I'll just comment on Kate's excellent presentation. I do think the book is very interesting. I mean, obviously, it was very important when I first read it, which would have been 82 when it came out, because I am a historian and I'm very interested in all those women. A lot of them, obviously, I knew about, because, I've written Belligerent or Enemies. Well, I haven't written that yet, but I've done a lot of work towards all of that. But there were women there that I would never have known about, and that was absolutely terrific. And the amount of work is extraordinary. But I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the difference in politics at the time and what she writes at the end about the differences between women. I don't know what she was talking about, but that's very interesting because, of course, I was totally there and totally involved in very serious differences between women. So I suspect that the differences that I know of might relate to what she was talking about at the end there. And of course, in 1977, I was involved in starting revolutionary feminism. By 1978, I was very much involved in lesbian feminist politics, and we had a distinct kind of politics, which was working against violence against women, extremely critical of male sexuality and the construction of sexuality, and so on. And a lot of women wanted us to shut up. I mean, really, really did. It was a very, very, very fierce struggle at that time. I never knew Dale. I guess she was a different kind of feminist from me because I never saw her anywhere, never came across her. She was working in a different world, which was definitely not the same world as me, which was lesbian feminism, working against male violence, etc. And I think it is interesting, therefore, that as I put in the chat, and I think the last time you talked about this, I mentioned that too, that in the early 90s in Australia, I was on a chat show, an evening chat show on television with Dale. They invited me and Dale to talk about Madonna. I think she'd just done her sex book. She was at the height of her horrendous pornographic pop. Really, to me, it was absolutely horrendous. And Dale was on there invited to say that Madonna was a great role model for young women, particularly adolescent girls. She would give them confidence and empowerment and so on. I was completely horrified because to me she was the absolute opposite about that. It was about teenage girls having to totally objectify and sexualize themselves for men's excitement and the opposite. But I think that might show the difference in politics developing between Dale and me, and the fact that, of course, she was heterosexual, married, and as you say, talks about her chap, whereas I was completely a separatist at that time. So there were very big differences. But the book stands, which is that it was an extraordinary work of scholarship and wonderful that it is there. But it is interesting that at the end of it, she talks about these differences. And I suspect I know what the differences are, basically.
Yeah, I think you've summarized them there. And I can remember going to my first very wide-eyed, innocent, going to my first Women's Liberation Conference in Sydney in about 1977 or 1978. I was like 17 at the time. And it became an argument between lesbians and heterosexual women, about whether you could be a feminist and not be a separatist. And, what was the appropriate and political relationship that feminists could have to men. And I think it's still, it's still something that is there. But my feeling about the internecine debates in part is if you've got a movement that wants to really do something for 51% of the population, there are going to be loads of different ideas. So I suppose I just think there's a point at which, if we could learn how to disagree with each other without it being seen as a weakness. But I suppose I see her view as we're just giving men ammunition to throw back at us as, oh, those women, they're always arguing with each other. I don't know. But yeah. But I think your point about the book standing is, and I think what you point out, Sheila, about probably the 80s and 90s being this moment of bifurcation almost between a kind of liberal feminism and a more radical kind of analysis is pertinent. Anyway, sorry.
I mean, I remember when this first came out, and you know, every woman everywhere who tried to say anything about anything, or to have an opinion, or to say maybe this isn't right, it was just like, well, they slapped me down, you know, or just couldn't get her voice across. And this book comes out, and lo and behold, it's not an individual thing. It's systematic. I mean, it's like it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and it's not just back in the 70s. It's not just back in the 60s. It's back to the 19th century. It's back to the Middle Ages. It's forever. It's forever. It was just centuries of women trying to, you know, contribute things and not and having our voices just systematically dismissed or suppressed, so that you know, and it's not, you can say, well, it's a cultural thing, you know, this happened in a cultural, but centuries everywhere, all over the world, lots of different cultures. So it's not just a cultural thing for one group of women in one place and one time. It's all over the place. And she did this book was an incredible job of documenting that. I mean, through centuries. And you know, I think there's been more work since then. And I, you know, when you say about women, you know, men saying, "Oh, these women just argue among themselves," I don't know if that. I think what that means is that women actually talk to each other and listen to what the other one says, and it's not just like a locker room saying, "Hey, whoa, no." It's like, "Oh yeah." I mean, because when you hear men talking to each other, it's basically just a bullying match until, you know, until one of them establishes dominance. So she just did a great job of illustrating what happens when women actually speak, which is when actual communication and maybe problem solving can happen. I mean, God, even the Pope said it at one point, if things are working, it's because women are running them. So, which I thought was pretty cool. And as for the separatism, I think, you know, the very, very early women's movement talked a lot about separatism, lesbian separatism in particular, but just general separatism. And that idea was like a beacon, was like a torch that was lit for just a very brief time. There was maybe, I call it, you know, the Camelot of the women's movement, one brief shining moment for maybe 10 years where women said, yeah, you know, there's something about that, and that may be the only way that we can like have a community, really communicate and do something. And then, you know, then a whole bunch of things happened, and you know, and Sheila even wrote a book about queer politics, and it was more than just about queer politics. It was about how men's values and how men want to run the world kind of insidiously forced its way into everybody else's life, including women's lives, and just, you know, kind of took over. But I think there is something to be said about separatism that we don't talk about because some women just, you know, immediately bristle. But there's something about it that I think we should talk about. And if it means we yell at each other for a while, which we shouldn't. I mean, we can, you know, have a conversation without yelling at each other. There may be disagreement, but I think it is really, really worth talking about now, especially now. Some woman in the chat mentioned something about, you know, the LARPing men, you know, who say that they're women saying, well, I'll just use all the disabled bathrooms. That's not a good idea either. But these are things that women need to get back into the conversation and start talking about it again. And just like, you know, we don't let them shut us up.
Yeah, and I think the current UK, I mean, I know things are very different in the US and Australia, but the recent UK legal decision about the meaning of woman and sex in the Equality Act has really brought home how much women, you know, there might be different sorts of separatism, and the idea of single sex spaces and women only groups as almost refuges from patriarchy, I think is something we're all very familiar with, aren't we? There might be different kinds of separatism. What's very rarely spoken about with the Pankhursts and their version of militant activism was it was prefaced by critique of male sexuality as it was constructed at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And yes, Sheila, you're nodding. They were into women withholding sex, not having anything to do with men, really calling men on their sexual kind of what would be the word, profligacy, or I don't know, concupiscence is the word that Shakespeare uses. They
Lovely
were,
word.
yeah. Sorry, it's a really egghead word. Trying to think of the word, but they were, and it's not often spoken about because that raises well, they were prudes. They hated men. They didn't like sex, and you're thinking, no, it's not about that. Who knows? I don't know what their sexuality was, but it's about a different model of relationship, I suppose. But it's not often talked about, is it, Sheila, that the suffragettes had that grounding in a critique of
No, their critique of sexuality and the fact that they had a theory of sexuality was absolutely not, it's not talked about. And that's why I wrote Spinster and Her Enemies, of course, because that rejection and requirement that men totally transform their sexuality in order to be in any way civilized companions of women, that went on throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century. But I think I should just say, in relation to the discussion we're having on separatism, that all the separatists I knew, and we were all separatists, the women I knew and were in my network in the late 70s, early 80s, we were totally committed to working for mainly heterosexual women, working against violence and domestic violence, working against rape, working to transform sexuality so that they didn't have to put up with the vile sex that men were presenting to them. I mean, I still do it, and that's what we were doing. So we weren't sort of going off to a desert island somewhere. Our separatism was in order to work on all of that for women, and particularly heterosexual women who were our focus, because they were the victims of all of this violence.
Yeah.
I like what I'm starting to see occasionally, and I wish it would happen or could happen more often, maybe something we should be supporting, is heterosexual women and their kids raising their kids together, buying a house between them with whatever resources that they have, and having 2, 3, or 4 women sharing the responsibilities in a community. The nuclear family is horrendous for heterosexual women, even for women whose they say their husband's, he's a great guy. It is just, you're with this kid, you're with 2 kids, 3 kids. It can be demoralizing. It's absolutely, some of the work is drudge work. It's not all happy, smiling, cooing babies and pleasant toddlers. I mean, it's really, really difficult. And community, think about how much of the world raises children in communities where the women are raising the kids together and the men are going off and grabbing their crotches and hunting, banana peels or whatever they do. I see that as a kind of separatism that does so much for heterosexual women who do it, who say, oh my God, I don't think I could do this alone. I'm surprised I even thought about doing it alone or tried to do it alone. That's a kind of separatism that really meets the needs of what is so crushing for so many straight women trying to raise kids.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that I've heard it said by fairly sort of pragmatic, or maybe they're liberal feminists, I don't know. Well, you can't have a major grassroots popular movement for half the population if you alienate what they see as their principal relationship, i.e. heterosexual women. But I think what you're suggesting is a way of doing that without I'm waffling here, but I suppose it's the older version of the family, isn't it? Where you have multi-generational families in a house, The men come and do their thing, and the grandmother, the mother, and the other, you know, the three or
Aunts and cousins. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a yes.
I mean,
sorry, I'm going to butt in now. We need
Yes.
to stop. It's 11 o'clock.
all right, okay.
That's my role. So there are breakout rooms which you people can join, or otherwise see you next week. And thank you so much, Kate. That was brilliant.
Well, thank you for asking me, and thanks for listening, everyone. It's
Thanks
a great
very much.
opportunity.
Brilliant.